A woman booked herself first class and her son economy, but their entire scam was exposed in front of everyone. The woman had been planning this seat grab since she booked her tickets 3 weeks ago. She deliberately purchased one first-class ticket for herself and an economy ticket for her son. But really, Diane had read about this technique in her mommy Facebook group. Book economy for the kid, then guilt someone into switching. You save $4,000 and still get both seats up front. Her friend Louise had done it on 3 different flights. Works every time, Louise had posted. Just pick someone traveling alone and make them feel like a monster for not helping a child. Diane had even practiced her speech in the mirror, perfecting the exact quiver in her voice when she'd mention her son's anxiety. The flight from Miami to Seattle was full. Diane boarded first with her son Aiden, who was 12, but she'd told the gate agent he was 8 to get early boarding. She settled into 2A while scanning first class for her target. That's when she saw me in 3B. Traveling alone, working on my laptop, no wedding ring. Perfect. She sent Aiden to the economy with clear instructions. Count to 300, then come back crying. Tell them you're scared and alone. Aiden had protested that he was fine with the economy, that he had his switch and snacks, but Diane grabbed his shoulder. Do you want to fly first class or not? This is how we get nice things. Be smart about it. 5 minutes after takeoff, Aiden appeared in first class with fake tears that Diane had made him practice. Mommy, I'm scared back there. All those strangers. Please let me sit with you. Diane immediately stood up and looked directly at me. Excuse me, but my son has severe anxiety. He needs to sit with me. Would you mind switching to his economy seat so he can have yours? I looked up from my laptop. I paid for this specific seat. It's a business trip. Diane's voice got louder so other passengers could hear. Are you really going to make a child sit alone and terrified for 5 hours? What kind of person does that? The man in 2B looked uncomfortable. The woman across the aisle was watching. Diane had created her audience. My son is 8 years old, she lied. He's never flown alone. I thought he could handle it, but clearly he can't. You're an adult. You can handle the economy. I pointed out the obvious. If you knew he had anxiety, why didn't you book seats together? Diane had her answer ready. The airline made a mistake. They promised to seat us together, but then separated us. It's not our fault. Please just be a decent human being. Help a mother and child. The flight attendant Sandra came over. What seems to be the issue? This woman won't give up her seat for my baby, Diane announced. He's 8 and scared, and she doesn't even care. Sandra looked at Aiden, who was nearly as tall as she was. She pulled out her tablet. Can I see boarding passes, please? I showed mine on my phone. Diane huffed and pulled out her phone, showing her first-class ticket. Sandra looked at Aiden. And yours, young man? He pulled out the crumpled economy boarding pass. Sandra studied her tablet for a long moment. Mrs. Randolph, it shows here you purchased these tickets separately, 3 weeks apart. The first-class ticket was bought with miles. The economy ticket was a basic economy fare purchased yesterday. Diane's face went red. The timing doesn't matter. My son needs to sit with me. Sandra kept reading. It also shows you selected seats during booking. You specifically chose 2A for yourself and 32E for your son. You confirmed these selections. That was a mistake, Diane insisted. I meant to choose seats together. Sandra turned to Aiden. How old are you? 8, he said quietly. Sandra smiled. The birthday on this booking says you turned 12 last month. That makes you an unaccompanied minor only if you're flying alone, which you're not since your mother is on the plane. Diane grabbed Sandra's arm. Listen, I'm a platinum member. I fly this airline constantly. I deserve respect and accommodation. Sandra removed Diane's hand. Ma'am, attempting to fraudulently claim your child is younger for boarding privileges is against federal aviation regulations. Moreover, attempting to coerce another passenger to give up their purchased seat through false claims is harassment. But he needs to sit with me. He has anxiety. Sandra pulled up another screen. According to your booking, you didn't purchase an unaccompanied minor service, didn't note any medical conditions, and didn't request adjacent seating. In fact, you specifically declined to pay the $40 fee for seat selection that would have guaranteed seats together. Diane was getting desperate. Her face went bright red, like someone had just slapped her across both cheeks. She looked around at all the passengers watching, at Sandra still holding her tablet with all those records, at me sitting there refusing to move. Instead of backing down like I expected, she pointed her finger right at Sandra and said in this loud voice that everyone could hear that I must have paid Sandra off somehow. She actually claimed I'd bribed the flight attendant to lie about the booking records and make up fake information to humiliate her and her son. The man in 2B started laughing out loud, which made it even worse for her. His laugh wasn't mean exactly, but it was the kind of laugh you do when someone says something so crazy you can't help yourself. That laugh made her face turn even redder, and I could see her hands shaking as she tried to regain some control over the situation that was falling apart around her. Sandra didn't even blink at the accusation. Her voice stayed completely calm and professional as she explained that all booking records are electronic and time-stamped by the airline's central computer system. She told everyone listening that it's impossible for any individual flight attendant to change or alter those records in any way. Sandra said if Mrs. Randolph truly believed there had been an error in the booking system, she was welcome to file a formal complaint after the flight with the airline's customer service department. But right at that moment, Sandra explained, they needed to resolve the seating situation, so the flight could continue safely. That's when Mrs. Art Randolph grabbed her phone from her pocket and started demanding to speak to Sandra's supervisor immediately. Her voice got even louder as she threatened to have Sandra fired for discrimination and harassment. She said she was going to sue the airline for discriminating against families with anxious children and for allowing their employees to humiliate paying customers in front of everyone. The woman sitting across the aisle from me suddenly spoke up. She said she'd witnessed this exact same scam attempt on 2 previous flights in the past year. She explained how parents would book themselves in premium seats and put their kids in economy, then guilt-trip solo travelers into switching by claiming the airline made a mistake or the child had special needs. Several other first-class passengers started nodding their heads in agreement. One older man a few rows back said he'd fallen for it once on a flight to Denver and regretted it the entire 5 hours when he realized halfway through that he'd been manipulated. He said the kid had been fine the whole time, playing games on his phone and eating snacks, while the mother enjoyed her free upgrade in his seat. Another woman mentioned she'd read about this tactic in a travel forum where people shared tips on how to scam their way into better seats without paying for them. Sandra waited for the other passengers to finish, then looked directly at Mrs. Randolph with a very serious expression. She explained that Mrs. Randolph had exactly 2 options available to her right now. Option 1 was that she could return to economy seat 32E, where her son's ticket was assigned, and sit there for the rest of the flight. Option 2 was that she could purchase an upgrade right now to move Aiden into the empty first-class seat next to her, which would cost exactly $1,200 based on the current price difference between economy and first class on this route. Sandra paused for a second, then added that if Mrs. Randolph refused both options, the captain would be forced to return to the gate and have airport security remove both her and her son from the flight entirely. The entire first-class cabin went completely silent. Nobody moved or made a sound. Everyone was watching to see what she would do next. I could actually see her brain working behind her eyes as she calculated whether her pride was worth missing the flight completely and having to buy new tickets on another airline. That's when Aiden spoke up in this quiet voice that barely carried past the first few rows. He said, "Mom, can we please just go sit in the back like we were supposed to?" He told her he'd already said this wouldn't work, and he really didn't want to get kicked off the plane. The way he said it, with this tired embarrassment in his voice, made it completely clear this wasn't the first time. He'd been through this before, probably multiple times. He knew exactly what his mother had been planning from the start, and he'd known it was going to fail. What made it even sadder was realizing she'd turned him into an unwilling partner in her schemes. She'd made him practice fake crying and taught him what to say to make people feel guilty. But he was old enough now to understand it was wrong, and he was stuck going along with it anyway, because she was his mother, and he didn't have a choice. Mrs. Randolph turned and shot him a look that made him physically flinch backward. Her eyes had this cold anger in them that made my stomach hurt to see. She reached up and grabbed her designer leather bag from the overhead compartment with so much force that it swung down and nearly smacked the man in 2B right in the head. He had to duck sideways to avoid getting hit. She didn't apologize or even seem to notice. Without saying another word to anyone, she started walking toward the back of the plane. But she grabbed Aiden's wrist as she passed him and dragged him behind her. She was pulling hard enough that he stumbled, trying to keep up with her pace. As they disappeared down the aisle toward economy, I could hear her hissing angry whispers at him. I couldn't make out the exact words, but the tone made it clear she was blaming him for what had just happened. The first-class cabin stayed quiet for about 10 seconds after they left. Then everyone started talking at once. The conversations were all quiet and respectful, but there was this shared sense of disbelief at what we'd all just witnessed. The man in 2B turned around and started telling the people behind him about another entitled passenger incident he'd seen last month. The woman across the aisle was shaking her head and talking to her husband about how some people have absolutely no shame. Other passengers were pulling out their phones, probably to text their friends about the crazy scene they'd just witnessed on their flight. I felt this wave of relief wash over me that I'd stood my ground and hadn't given in to the pressure and manipulation. But at the same time, I felt genuinely worried about Aiden. He clearly hadn't wanted any part of his mother's scam, and now he was probably getting blamed for its failure. I kept thinking about that angry look she'd given him, and the way she'd grabbed his wrist, and I wondered if this was what his life was like all the time. About 30 minutes into the flight, after things had calmed down and most people had gone back to their laptops or books or movies, the woman across the aisle leaned over toward me. She introduced herself as Bethany Calderon, and said she'd been watching the whole situation unfold with professional interest. She told me she's a child psychologist who works with families dealing with difficult dynamics, and she'd recognized all the warning signs of a parent using their child as a manipulation tool in really unhealthy ways. She explained that kids like Aiden often end up developing serious anxiety and trust issues from being forced to participate in their parents' dishonest schemes over and over. She said the fact that he'd quietly resisted his mother's plan and tried to get her to stop was actually a really healthy sign of his own moral development happening, despite her negative influence. Bethany mentioned she sees cases like this more often than people would think, where kids are taught that lying and manipulating others is just how you get what you want in life. Sandra came by during drink service and stopped at my seat. She leaned down and quietly thanked me for not giving in to the pressure back there. She explained that these seat scam attempts have become so common in the past few years that flight attendants now receive specific training on exactly how to handle them. Airlines have had to create whole protocols and procedures because it was happening on so many flights. Sandra told me that some passengers attempt this same manipulation on literally every single flight they take, moving from airline to airline once they get caught too many times on one carrier. She pulled out her tablet again and showed me Mrs. Randolph's booking history. The pattern was right there in the records, showing she'd tried similar tactics on at least 6 previous flights in just the past year alone. That's why Sandra had recognized what was happening so quickly and knew exactly how to respond. About 90 minutes into the flight, I needed to use the bathroom. The one in first class had someone in it, so I walked back through the curtain into economy to find an available one. That's when I spotted them in their assigned seats near the back of the plane in row 32. Aiden had his headphones on and was staring out the window with this miserable expression on his face. He wasn't looking at his phone or his Switch or anything, just staring out at the clouds with that sad, defeated look that kids get when they're in trouble for something that wasn't really their fault. Mrs. Randolph was in the seat next to him, angrily typing on her phone with her thumbs moving fast across the screen. I could see from the way she was typing, all aggressive and forceful, that she was probably writing complaint emails to the airline right now. She was most likely describing how she'd been mistreated and humiliated by the crew, leaving out all the parts about her lies and manipulation, and making herself sound like an innocent victim of discrimination. I walked back down the aisle toward first class, still processing what I'd just seen in economy. Aiden's eyes met mine for just a second. His mother had her face buried in her phone screen, typing furiously with both thumbs. He mouthed something to me. "I'm sorry." The words were silent but completely clear. My chest tightened unexpectedly. This kid was apologizing to me for his mother's behavior, like he was somehow responsible for her choices. I gave him a small nod and mouthed back, "Not your fault." The relief that washed over his face was immediate and heartbreaking. He managed a tiny smile before quickly looking away as his mother glanced up from her phone. I continued walking back to my seat, that brief exchange replaying in my mind. When I settled back into 3B, I couldn't shake the image of Aiden's face, that look of genuine embarrassment and shame. He knew exactly what his mother had tried to do. He understood it was wrong. The realization sat heavy in my stomach. This wasn't the first time she'd pulled something like this, and it probably wouldn't be the last. Bethany looked over from across the aisle. She must have noticed something in my expression. "Everything okay?" I nodded, but found myself telling her about what just happened, about Aiden's silent apology, about the look on his face. Bethany's professional demeanor shifted slightly. She leaned closer, keeping her voice low. "That's actually a really important sign. Kids in these situations often feel responsible for their parents' manipulative behavior. They desperately want to distance themselves from it, but they're trapped." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "The fact that he apologized to you means he's aware his mother's actions are wrong. That's his own moral compass developing despite her influence. But it also means he's probably carrying a lot of guilt and shame that isn't his to carry." About 20 minutes later, I was working on my laptop when movement in my peripheral vision caught my attention. Diane had appeared in first class. Her face was set in angry determination as she marched straight toward the front row. I realized with a jolt that Aiden was sitting in the empty seat next to Bethany. He must have come forward while his mother was in the bathroom. Diane grabbed his arm and yanked him out of the seat with enough force that he stumbled. Her voice carried through the cabin, loud and sharp. "What are you doing up here bothering these nice people who already made it clear they don't care about our family?" The passive aggression dripped from every word. She was trying to make us feel guilty, trying to paint Aiden as the problem while simultaneously making herself the victim. Aiden's face went red. Several passengers looked up from their devices and books. Bethany's voice cut through the tension, calm and measured. Aiden wasn't bothering anyone. He was actually being remarkably polite and mature. Diane's mouth opened, clearly ready to argue, but she seemed caught off guard. She'd obviously expected us to agree with her, to validate her anger at her son. The man in 2B turned in his seat. "Aiden is welcome in first class anytime as a guest, unlike certain other people." His emphasis on the last 3 words was unmistakable. Several passengers around us murmured agreement. One woman nodded firmly. Another man said something quietly to his seatmate that made them both look at Diane with obvious disapproval. Diane's face turned that familiar shade of red again. She opened her mouth, closed it, then grabbed Aiden's wrist and dragged him back down the aisle toward economy. I watched them go, seeing Aiden's shoulders hunched in embarrassment. The captain's voice came over the intercom announcing our descent into Seattle. I found myself staring at the back of the plane, watching the curtain that separated first class from economy. Diane would tell this story completely differently to her friends. She'd paint herself as the victim of cruel passengers and power-hungry flight attendants. She'd probably leave out the part about lying about Aiden's age. She'd definitely leave out the part about deliberately booking separate seats to save money. She'd make herself sound like a loving mother just trying to care for her anxious child. But I kept thinking about Aiden, about that apologetic look on his face, about how aware he clearly was that his mother's behavior wasn't normal or acceptable. Maybe seeing her manipulation fail so publicly would help him recognize that what she does is wrong. Maybe it would help him understand that he doesn't have to follow her example. Even if he couldn't escape it yet, maybe someday he'd remember this flight and make different choices. The plane touched down with a slight bump. Passengers immediately started unbuckling seatbelts and reaching for overhead compartments despite the flight attendant's reminder to remain seated. I gathered my laptop and bag, moving slowly. That's when I saw Diane rushing past my row toward the exit. She had her phone pressed to her ear, talking loudly enough for everyone to hear. "Yes, I need to file a formal complaint. The treatment I received was completely unacceptable. Discriminatory." My realization hit instantly. She was absolutely going to try to get Sandra in trouble. She was going to lie to customer service just like she'd lied to the passengers. She was going to twist the whole story to make herself look innocent. I made a quick decision. Instead of deplaning immediately, I waited near my seat until Sandra came down the aisle. I told her I'd be happy to provide a witness statement if she needed one. Sandra's expression shifted from professional politeness to genuine gratitude. That would actually be really helpful. These complaints get taken seriously even when they're clearly false, and having passenger witnesses makes all the difference. We walked off the plane together, making our way up the jetway. Sure enough, when we reached the gate area, Diane was already at the podium. A tired-looking woman in an airline uniform stood behind the counter, listening with the practiced patience of someone who'd heard similar complaints 1,000 times before. Her name tag read, Mullen. Diane's voice carried across the waiting area. The flight attendant was incredibly rude to me and my son. She humiliated us in front of other passengers. She refused to help when my child was in distress. Mullen looked up as we approached. Her eyes flicked from Sandra to me. Were you on this flight? I nodded and stepped forward. So did Bethany, who'd been walking behind us. The man from 2B appeared as well, along with another passenger I recognized from first class. All of us ready to explain exactly what happened. Diane's face went pale as she realized multiple passengers were about to contradict her story. Mullen's fingers moved across her keyboard. Let me pull up the booking records. The screen reflected in her glasses as she scrolled through information. Her expression remained neutral, but I saw her eyebrows raise slightly. Mrs. Randolph, I'm seeing the same pattern here that the flight attendant noted. Separate ticket purchases, deliberate seat selections, declined seat selection fees. Mullen's voice remained professional but firm. Your platinum status is being flagged for review. We've received multiple reports over the past year of attempted seat scams and passenger harassment. You'll receive a formal letter from our customer relations department within 10 business days. Diane tried to interrupt, but Mullen held up one hand. Ma'am, manipulating other passengers and filing false complaints against crew members are both violations of our terms of service. This is being documented in your passenger record. Diane's mouth opened and closed. She looked at each of us, searching for sympathy or support. She found none. Finally, she grabbed her carry-on bag and stalked toward the exit without another word. I headed down to baggage claim, feeling oddly drained. The carousel was just starting to move when Sandra appeared next to me. Thank you again for speaking up at the gate. Passenger witnesses make all the difference in these cases. The airline takes complaints seriously even when they're obviously false, so having multiple people willing to verify what actually happened really matters. I asked if she dealt with situations like this often. She laughed, but it wasn't a happy sound. At least once a month. Sometimes more. People read about these seat scam techniques online and think they're clever. They don't realize flight attendants have seen it all before. We have specific training now on how to handle these situations because they became so common. She shook her head. The worst part is the kids. They know what their parents are doing is wrong, but they can't do anything about it. I thought about Aiden's face again. That silent apology. That look of shame that no 12-year-old should have to carry. My luggage appeared on the carousel and I grabbed it before heading outside to find a ride. The night air felt cool after the recycled airplane atmosphere. I pulled out my phone and requested a car, watching the little icon move closer on the map. A silver sedan pulled up 3 minutes later, and the driver helped me load my bag into the trunk. We pulled away from the airport, merging onto the highway toward downtown Seattle. The driver glanced at me in the rearview mirror and asked how my flight was. I laughed and told him it was interesting, then found myself explaining the whole situation with Diane and her seat scam attempt. He shook his head and chuckled, saying he sees that kind of entitled behavior constantly in his job too. People try to manipulate their way to special treatment all the time, claiming they need to go somewhere urgently or deserve a discount for some made-up reason. We talked about how standing up to it feels good in the moment, but probably doesn't actually change the people doing it. Diane will likely just adjust her technique and try again on a different airline, maybe picking a less crowded flight or targeting someone who looks more easily guilted. The driver agreed that some people just operate that way, and no single confrontation will fix them. A week later, I met my colleague Sarah for coffee at our usual spot near the office. We settled into a corner table with our drinks and she asked about my Seattle trip. I ended up telling her the whole flight story, describing Diane's scam and how it all unraveled. Sarah listened quietly, then asked if I felt bad about how things turned out for Diane and Aiden. I thought about it for a moment before answering. I explained that I feel satisfied about maintaining my boundaries and not rewarding manipulative behavior. But I genuinely worry about Aiden growing up with a mother who teaches him that dishonesty and guilt-tripping are acceptable ways to get what you want. The truth is that standing your ground against one entitled person on one flight doesn't fix the bigger problem of entitlement culture. But at least Aiden saw that his mother's tactics don't always work. Maybe that small lesson will matter to him someday, even if it doesn't change anything right now.